You asked and Imperial listened. Due to extreme popularity and brewer demand, the A44 Kveik blend is being released as a year-round available strain. This blend of 3 proprietary Kveik strains absolutely loves hot fermentations, producing beers bursting with fruity notes of pineapple, guava, and tropical flavors. Use it for your summer blonde ales, your hazy IPA, or anything else you want to have a delectable fruity fermentation character. And A44 is absolutely perfect for those who may not have the ability to precisely control fermentation temperatures. Just pitch your pouch and let her rip. Pick up your homebrew pouch wherever Imperial Yeast is sold and place commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. A fairly common profession among 18th century working class Londoners involved carrying items such as luggage to and from various locations. A person of such employment was referred to as a porter, which, as legend has it, is where one of the most popular styles of dark ale got its name. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the delicious style of English porter is contributor Malcolm Frazer.
This is a great style to talk about because brewing aficionados love it, and then all the haze boys hate it and fall asleep. So
we just lost half of our listeners, man.
I freaking love porter. See, porter is awesome because if you take away the word porter and insert IPA, a lot of the same history just repeats itself.
Right.
So it follows a very similar arc. It was the most important beer of its time, and just as IPA is now, especially commercially, right? And it went along this change over time, and it became almost nothing like it was during its origin, which is what's kind of happening to IPA. So it's interesting in that. And also, just like any other beer, it follows the history of humankind. You know, all the humankind changes, wars and taxation and ingredients and industrialization change the beer. And I think that happens with IPA too.
Yeah, I love talking about styles that have such a rich history. I can't recall precisely when I first had an English porter, but I definitely remember my first experience with a domestic version of porter in general. It was Deschutes Black Butte Porter, because it was a huge inspiration for me to start homebrewing, actually. At this point in time, I've had a few commercial and homebrewed examples of English porter, but not a ton, I think in part because it's so difficult to find over here in the States. Almost, I would say the good majority of the genuine traditional English porter that I've had has been when I'm traveling, when I was over in Ireland last year, when I've been in London, stuff like that. So I look forward to talking with you about it, as well as my attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. But first, if you like what we're up to and you want to keep us doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you're going to receive a reward like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is lager brewing guru and brewmaster of Wayfinder Beer in Portland, Oregon, Kevin Davey. I cannot wait for this session. Malcolm, you've had the opportunity to drink at Wayfinder with me.
That was, to me, one of the better, I mean, there's a lot of good breweries there, but one of the ones that stood out to me was Wayfinder, and I especially loved their attention to detail on lagers. They had the side pour taps, and I remember talking to one of the bartenders, and he regaled me with the ability to pour 3 different types of beer using a side pour. I did like the 3 pours for their Czech pills.
Yeah. Oh my God, their Czech pills. It's magical. Yeah. We've driven through Portland, I think, twice now in the last couple of years, and I always make it a point to stop at Wayfinder. If you're in the Portland, Oregon area and you haven't tried it, you need to. All of that is because of Kevin Davey, or a large part of it at least is because of Kevin Davey. Again, he's going to be taking questions from patrons later the month of February 2020. Past guests have included folks like Chop and Brew's Chip Walton, Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River, hop expert Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and so many more. And they are all available to watch whenever you like on our private Facebook page. Again, learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And cheers to all of the people who are our patrons at this point. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the BH15 single-tier system. This thing is a true work of art. It comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Joe Steins wrote in with a very valid complaint about our recent episode on electric brewing. He said, I just listened to the episode and you didn't mention induction as an option. I use a 220 volt, 3500 watt induction hob, which is basically a cooktop. With a SS Brewtech kettle, it works great and there's no element to clean. You also have the ability to set a precise temperature right on the induction hob. Mine has a resolution of 2 degrees Fahrenheit or about 1 degree C and holds pretty close to that, especially if I'm recirculating. Since I have the ability to hold water at a specific temperature, I use it for sous vide cooking as well. I bring this up because as I got more into sous vide, I picked up a sous vide water heater, which also works great to heat up sparge water to a very precise temperature as well. So I now use my induction hob for the mash and boil, and then I fly sparge with water I heat up using my sous vide machine. I just wanted to bring up the crossover between electric brew equipment and sous vide cooking equipment. Cool stuff available these days. The fact that we forgot to discuss induction at all is kind of a bummer to me, because I've got a local friend here who that's 100% how he brews nowadays, and it is amazing. Very good point that you no longer have an element to clean when you're using an induction cooktop. And then also, failing to talk about sous vide, which seems to be the hot topic right now when it comes to cooking. That's our bad, Joe, so I appreciate you pointing it out.
I like the fact that you said hob, being of British heritage there. It's always funny talking to my relatives, and they'll say and they use numbers too, like on their stoves. A lot of times they'll say, put it on a setting of 4 or 3, and we tend to say, low, medium, high.
Right.
Right. It's kind of, she's like, heat it up on the hob at around a 6.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell is a 6?
Are you using I know you sous vide cook. Do you use your sous vide machine for anything other than cooking meat?
I use it for eggs, so I guess it's a protein.
But in the brewing process, Malcolm.
Yeah, in the brewing process, no. But for making yogurt or kefir or yeast starters, I've started experimenting with doing like a fast hot leaven.
Oh yeah.
So instead of having to wait 3 or 4 hours for your yeast starter to get going, I'll set it around like 75, 80 degrees, because it's a little bit colder up here in Ohio, Cleveland area.
Yeah.
So I've gone as high as 85, 90. So I take my starter out, put it in, feed it with some, flour and wheat.
Yeah.
Wheat flour and bread flour and some water. And then I put it in there, and it's ripping and roaring in about 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point, Joe, particularly the crossover thing. I know of a lot of people who are brewing on electric systems who are able to, set a precise temperature and use it to cook meat. If you haven't tried sous vide, give it a shot. I'm not personally a huge fan of it. I'd rather do old school grilling, but that's just me. I know that's a blasphemous thing to say around certain people, but yeah, you can definitely use electric brewing equipment for sous vide as well. So great feedback, Joe. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. I love most crisp, pale, clean styles of beer, and one of my favorites is Kolsch. Well, listener Ryan Gade from Easton, Pennsylvania sent me a bottle he brewed with his dad, both of whom he said got their start about 3 years ago.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Ooh, it's a little bit. Don't be fooled by the rocks that I got. I'm still Jersey from the block.
That's clear.
Woo! There's a lot going on. Yeah, it's got a little spike in there, but good. Nah, that was the first hit only. Now I'm just getting a good, smooth beer.
Yeah, very smooth.
Just a good, smooth, clean, crisp beer. I like it.
It's just okay for me. A little pear to it.
Pear.
Like a pear flavor.
Yeah. It's the best pear I've ever had in my mouth.
It's a good pear beer right here.
No, I don't taste any fruit.
It's smooth.
I don't know what I taste. It's a good beer. Remember I told Marshall he needs to put up every single, like when he does that hop thingy that he sends us, he's like, drink this and say what it says.
Yeah,
say what it
with
tastes
all
like.
the descriptors so we
He needs
know.
to put a thing up on the wall with all of the descriptors, and then we'll just pick
And
something.
we can just go down. Yes, yes, no.
Because you can't tell us what we think. If I think it tastes like toast, I can't be wrong, right?
Yeah.
Dude, we're letting him make us look like fools is my point.
Easy task.
That's a good beer. I like that a lot. The first drink I took, it was like a punch to the face, but I think that's just because we hadn't cleansed our palates.
Yeah. It's very clean, and I'm going to finish it right now.
I liked it. It's gone, so I can't make any more reviewing. All I can talk about is the past. 5 jerseys.
Yeah, 5. Now I'm going to go 4.
Okay, for a total of 9. Oh,
First off, when we started the beer review thing, I absolutely did give the guys a list of descriptors, but you want to know who crumpled up the list and threw it in my face? Yeah, Jersey did that. So the most lovingly obstinate person I know is Jersey Bird. So now as far as the beer goes, I thought it was absolutely delicious, an incredibly well done example of the style. I got a really nice white bread note in the aroma, just a whisper of like a fruity note in the finish of the beer. That retro nasal thing when you're breathing out as you're swallowing. Otherwise, it was just super clean and really good. I could drink that beer all day long. Ryan did say that the recipe was inspired by my short and shoddy Kolsch, which is pretty cool. He did use a different yeast. He said he was looking for Dieter, but had to go with, I think he went with the 2565 from Y Yeast, which I've heard can impart a bit more ester character.
Yeah, I gave a lot of kudos for Tim there saying pears. So I think like a white Pinot Grigio character, grape skin and pears is common with that yeast.
Yeah.
So, good for Tim there.
Yeah. And good for Ryan and his dad for making a really good example of a Kolsch. I mean, to me, I've never used that particular yeast strain, but I think what kind of separates a Kolsch in my mind, and I know people will harp on the whole fermentation temperature thing, but really separates it characteristically from like a Pilsner or some other sort of a pale lager, is just a hint of not fruity like fruit basket fruit, but that, like you said, kind of white grape skin thing, little bit of pear type of thing, and it was definitely in this. Fantastic job. Thank you for sending that beer in. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, the focus will be on English Porter. We'll be right back. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. The English have a pretty vast beer and brewing history, one in which porter plays a pretty important and significant role, right, Malcolm?
Yeah, absolutely. So just in general, the whole industrialization of beer probably started in England, and it probably started with porter, and it took over the world. It was one of the most influential beers at the time. It's probably the first beer that was available around the world from a single location, There's so much debate in the history of it, and a lot of people know the early history of the whole account from, I believe the guy's name was John Feltham, wrote an article referring, it's confusing, but he wrote an article referring to someone else's article. So in 1802, he referred to a writing that was in like 1788. And he talks about Obadiah Poundage speaking about Ralph Harwood. So Ralph Harwood is attributed to having, made this beer to replicate a practice. So supposedly there was a practice of publicans taking like the three threads, right? I'll take a little bit of this one and a little bit of that one, and you've got stale beer, a fresh beer, and maybe a 2-penny strong beer.
Right.
But that seems to be complete garbage, according to people who do much more research than I have, and have the ability to really. So they say, isn't it odd? These pendants, who might also actually be accurate,
right?
They say, why would the most famous beer in the world at the time have no single origin historical hero? Well, if it did have a single origin historical hero, why would his name never be mentioned for almost 80 years?
Yeah.
So 1802, the first time it's written about, is recounting a story that was told, 14, 15 years prior. It just seems odd.
It feels like a game of telephone. I mean, I could see how things would shift and evolve. The story, at the very least, would shift and evolve, having gone through so many people at this point.
And they're not even sure the three threads thing is accurate, right? It was it three threads, and there seems to be a lot of writings from the late 1600s about mixing of beers, and that seems plausible, right? You can imagine almost like a beer cocktail. This publican likes it. This publican blends it a little bit stronger this way or that way. Or maybe you're bringing a sweet element in from a fresher, younger, bigger beer to counteract a stale beer, which may have Brettanomyces character, might have some aged, sherry notes, all of which are beneficial. You paid more for the aged beer initially. So you can imagine there's some publicans trying to stand out by having their own special mix, right? But to say that one brewer said, you know what, I'm just going to make it all once, and they called it our entire butt. If that was a single person, you think someone would have mentioned it between, 1720 and 1802.
Right.
So good story. Sometimes good stories just get repeated and it's lazy. It's like, it's easy just to say, well, so-and-so said this story, so I'm going to repeat it because I did the research myself. Right.
They turn into fables more than they do accurate stories.
And I don't know the answer. I trust Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson's research more than just a story.
Yeah.
Because they could, their version could be portions of the truth too, because they only have the evidence that they can find now.
Right.
And 300 years ago, when porter was invented, circa 1720, people didn't seem to be as interested in documenting the historical accounts of who made what when. There's brewing logs, and that's what Ron Pattinson's work really drills down into, is the brewing logs.
Sure.
But the writings, which Ron refers to the writings as well, but Martin really seems to like going into the historical accounts from other writings. He'll say, oh, this advertisement said this, and then this brewing text said that. So between the two of them, it's kind of interesting to see where they come about.
Yeah.
And it looks like what probably happened was, brown beer was popular. Brown malt was the most common malt at the time. And brown beer was a thing. So it seems like probably porter is the natural evolution of a beer becoming brown ale to porter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of brown ale available, and a lot of the brown ale was aged by either brokers or publicans themselves. And probably brewers said, wait a second, they're aging this beer and selling it for a profit. Why don't we age it ourselves and sell it? And that became porter.
One of my understanding here, when it comes to porter and old English brown ale, is that there was a reason for that. And again, you are far more keen on the history of beer than I am. The reason was there really a pale beer in England in the 17th century? Or was brown ale more of a function? The fact that this beer was that color, and when I say brown ale here, I'm talking lowercase b brown ale, just the color of the beer, was because of their kilning practices. Was my understanding, or at least that's the fable that I heard.
Yeah, most beer back then was brown,
right?
Or some shade. There was amber malt too. There was some shades of light brown. There just wasn't a lot of pale beer. Wasn't a lot of pale malt even. So all the beers were not only made that color, they're kind of expected to be, and that's why when the invention and the paler malt became more available and more affordable, because there was some pale malts available, but they were super expensive. What happened is when they started putting more pale malt into the recipe, and we can talk about the taxation pressure or whatever. I mean, this is not supposed to be a history on porter. So, but essentially, when brewers realized that, hey, pale malt provides more extract, because of the invention of the hydrometer circa 1770. The invention of the brewing hydrometer. The hydrometer has been used since Greek times, and maybe even in way before that. So anyways, the hydrometer showed them that pale malt was more extract efficient. They went away from pale malt or from brown malt, but then they realized that the customers wanted the brown color.
Right.
So they started using adulterants, and then black malt when that was invented, that was by Daniel Wheeler, 1817. But essentially, the brown color and the brown flavor, that roasty chocolate, was part of the beer, so it was an expectation.
Right, right. And we know how people respond when their expectations aren't met. So
bias. So that's why even before there was patent malt available, they were using cooked down syrups and stuff before those were made illegal in 1816. But yes, that caramely chocolate flavor and color had to be there, otherwise the majority of the drinkers would reject it. Yeah.
So before we get into talking about what we conceive of modern English porter, I have to imagine, we can't really sample what English porter tasted like in the 1700s, but I have to imagine there were some pretty distinct differences from the way we describe it today. I hear a lot of rumors about how it was pretty standard to have some form of a Brettanomyces character in these old English ales, just because of the lack of understanding of the way that wild yeast and bacteria, keeping things clean, essentially. Describe what you've read about how these beers, how old school, traditional English porter likely tasted and smelled and such.
Well, that's kind of interesting because they didn't seem to do as much flavor descriptors, not in the same terms that we do,
Yeah.
But I remember listening to a podcast with Ron in which he had a brewer or a maltster recreate brown malt with diastatic power.
Oh yeah.
So nowadays most brown malt is not going to convert, right? It might have some minor Littner degrees for diastatic measurement, but so he had a maltster make it special for a recreation, like 100% brown malt porter, and then they introduced Brettanomyces. Well, the modern palate doesn't necessarily enjoy that.
The brown malt with Brettanomyces.
Yeah,
Ugh.
Yeah, a slightly cocoa and some roast element with more or less well attenuated, Brett finished beer.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what most people enjoy now.
Sounds like it'd clash, yeah.
But I made a very almost like an imperial mild, which sounds oxymoronic by today's terms, but there was milds back then that were higher alcohol, but they had a high finishing gravity.
Yeah.
So I made a mild and finished it with Brett, and it's an amazing beer. I think it tastes, somewhat tart, probably some acetic character. And I think it can be done right as long as there's some sweetness in there. But I would think, back then to have a slightly roasty beer with some Brett character, it'd have to be the right type of Brett,
Yeah.
I don't think you want to go super, super, super attenuated, but some of the brewing logs said that these beers were attenuated up to 75%. You know, that's pretty darn well attenuated by those standards in the late to mid 1700s.
Yeah, particularly given what I imagine the OGs of the worts were. I mean, we're talking times when beer was taxed based on its strength, right?
I have to look, when the overlaps were, because, the taxes changed depending on the situation.
Sure.
So right around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, yes, there was a tax, and I believe that one was for % on malt. So that was the downward pressure for using less malt, right? So depending on when the tax overlap, whether it was alcohol, mash tun size, or amount of malt. So somewhere around the Napoleonic Wars, I think the tax was on malt. So that's when brewers started shifting away from brown malt, which was less efficient. And they started realizing that, if I use pale malt, I get more extract per unit pound.
Sure.
So they started shifting upward to 50% or more of pale malt to avoid the tax.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of what happens. And then obviously the pale malt percentage goes up, the color goes down. So then you had to bring in either colorants, which were popular at the time, like basically taking a syrup and boiling it to death, all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
They use all sorts of, adulterants. But they also tried to avoid, because they're trying to sell it fresh, they bring in adulterants to make it taste older. So they were adding acids, and bittering agents beyond hops. So, but yeah, pretty much somewhere around 1770 when the hydrometer was invented, and then once you had the vector of malt tax from Napoleonic Wars, which is 1800s, early 1800s, they basically shifted the recipe. It impacted the beer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history. Shifting to our more modern conception of what English porter is, let's talk a little bit about at least the way the BJCP describes it, or what we might expect from a modern version of an English porter.
Okay, so unlike the old versions, if you're going to brew an older one, we kind of danced around it, but, you're not going to have that. The older versions would rely much more heavily on brown malt, which is like that, slightly acrid, roasty character.
Yeah.
And with some Brettanomyces background character. If you're going to do that, you have to enter it into like a historical or experimental, right? If you do a modern English porter, you're thinking more along the lines of the Taddy, Samuel Smith's Taddy.
Yeah.
Or London's, Fuller's London Porter. I mentioned those two just because you can get them in most places around the country.
And they're both delicious, in my opinion.
They're definitely delicious. Yeah. Try to find a fresher example or a place that moves them pretty well.
Yeah,
like, an English pub that sells them, or an English, just a location that turns the beer over, not one that you go there and the label's faded from the sun.
Right. Yeah, there's dust on top of the bottle type of thing.
Yeah. So those beers are, I think the London Porter was supposed to be a reenactment of when the beer went away in like the 1940s. So they're drier than they probably would have been back then, much more highly attenuated. They're not going to have Brett character. They tend to be more caramely and maybe not so much roast as toast and toffee and caramel.
Yep.
But that's the thing is when we're talking about beer, especially something like a porter that had like 150, 160 year lifespan, you have to say when, so, if you say I'm brewing a historical porter, it's like, so what, like, 1940s,
right.
1860s,
yeah.
So the modern ones are more or less like if you go to the BJCP or if you go to the World Beer Cup guidelines, they're representative of what you'd find now from breweries that exist today.
Right.
Aroma, bready biscuit. So they, people say no roast, but it's not no roast. It's low roast, and it's a subtle roast.
Yeah. The way that I explain it is, in beer, when I get a chocolatey note that's not from cacao nibs, basically, that is that subtle roast mixed with, it's not coffee. And I think a lot of people associate roast with either coffee or acrid ashy. And that's not what I'm talking about. But to me, it's almost this perfect balance of toasty for English porter, toasty, slightly nutty, and just a subtle whisper of chocolate is sort of what I expect from,
I think like that middle color chocolate.
Yeah.
And just before, like maybe if you toast like a wheat bread or even toasted nuts, if you toast nuts in a pan, just before they go burned, and reach into acrid, right there. It's if you take like a walnut and you toast it, it has a little bit of a roast character to it.
Definitely.
But it's not all the way to, Starbucks burnt coffee.
Right. Exactly.
So it's just short of coffee. It's more like dark, not even quite dark chocolate, to my palate. Bready for sure, biscuity for sure, and that classic English background of like the, I always think that Maris Otter and Thomas Foss's taste almost like peanut butter.
Yes.
And then if you smell hops, if you get a fresh example, you can have some EKG and Fuggle character, which is, floral, mushroomy, earthy, flowers, but not necessarily fresh, fragrant like roses, more like geraniums, maybe just past fresh.
Yeah.
Kind of like a wilted flower smell. I love it, but some people do not care for it.
I do not care for it, Malcolm. Yeah. I'm one of those who refrains from using EKG in my English beers because I get an interesting, like a perfect descriptor as always with you is that old geranium character, which is from the geraniol. I mean, that's where it kind of gets its name. But it's blended with an almost like marmalade, like an orange marmalade thing that just does not work with me. So I tend to use more Fuggles because I like that earthy kind of wet dirt, which sounds terrible, but I really appreciate. I
love wet dirt, man. Going out to like a compost bin and you turn it, or if you're out in the woods and you just grab like underneath the leaves.
Yes.
I love that.
So do I.
To me, it's almost sweet.
Yeah, it is. It's like sweet mushroomy thing. And that's what I like in my English porter. But again, this is a style where you're using, traditional English ingredients and, Fuggles and EKG may be two of the most popular English hops, but there are things like Challenger you can use. The idea though is to not overdo the hops so that it's, English porter to me is not a quote unquote balanced beer. It's much more malt forward with a, just enough hops to give it the proper bitterness and maybe a touch of character. This is again, my experience with the limited experience that I've had with this style. And then of course that traditional English yeast, I tend to prefer Fuller's. That's one of my favorite English breweries. And that would be like Imperial Yeast Pub or WLP002.
Yeah. I like 1099. I think that's the Whitbread. But yeah, I think those yeasts, and that's one of the brewer's arts is how you balance the esters. So you can dial them up a little bit, or with I think a Whitbread does, or you can go more restrained with like an 007, 002 from White Labs, and you'll still get a little bit of that English esters, apple pears, but it doesn't really stomp all over the beer. So that's the brewer's art, and then interplaying that with the hops. And like you said, marmalade, I usually attribute that more to an aged English beer, but I could definitely see the marmalade with EKG for sure, because you get a little bit of orange and then you add in the cocoa, and you kind of go towards that chocolate orange.
Well, and I've talked with so many people about the how difficult it is in a beer which has 4 main ingredients, and I am including water chemistry in this. How difficult it is to describe where exactly the characteristic that you're picking up is from. Could it be because of a blend of things? And, you look at English porter, which modern days, I would contend that the majority of your base malt's going to be a Maris Otter, or, you could substitute in something like a Northwest pale malt or something like that. That's got that bready, toasty component. Then you've got that subtle orange you get from EKG. What do you usually put marmalade on? It's toast, So it kind of like creates this impression in my mind. So it may not necessarily be just from the EKG, but I will say I'm not a hater, but I've used it on its own probably 4 or 5 times now, and I've realized it's just not my jam. So I stick with, no pun intended there, but I do stick with Fuggles.
I'm glad you said it because I was waiting.
What about, so we know that there are certain styles where adjunct usage, something like flaked maize or rice is very common. Would that ever be the case in a modern version of English porter? From my research, I couldn't find anything, but.
No. So there was times in English history when adjuncts weren't allowed. I think 1816 is when they didn't allow sugar and syrups for a little while. And that was because I think brewers were going to try to avoid the tax,
Yeah.
So, all things for tax and money, right? So modern, I would say a modern porter doesn't need it, with good brewing practices and mashing techniques, whatever, you'll get the attenuation you need because these beers finish. An English porter finishes like between 8 and 14 gravity points are 3.25 Plato.
Right.
That's fairly well attenuated. But if you mash, in the low 150s with good malt, you're going to get there. You know? So I just don't see why you would need it. I think if you were trying to recreate that certain segment of time, then cool. Brewing sugars are not uncommon.
Like treacle and stuff like that, right? Molasses, whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, molasses, dark. What was it? Lyle's golden syrup.
Yeah.
Those things, and that's a neat way to add an element to a beer to make it stand out. Say you're doing a competition, or if you just want to try to brew a historic example. But it's only a certain segment in time. If you go look through the old recipes from Pattinson's page, most of them, for most historical porters, it's going to be pale malt, brown malt, maybe some amber malt, and black patent malt. Rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
And then it's like the earlier you go, the more brown it's going to be, and the later you go, the more pale there's going to be. And then it seems for a little while amber drops off, and then it's just basically pale, like maybe 40 to 50% pale, 40 to 50% brown, and then like 5 to 10% black. Obviously, you have to slide that scale to make 100.
Yeah, and there are traditionalists out there who will say you have to use black malt, black patent malt. In part, I believe because
and brown malt. There's traditionalists who say if you don't use brown malt, it's not really a porter.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I feel like a part of the black patent thing, this is just me being presumptuous here, is because based on, again, what I've heard is that it was invented almost as to make styles like English porter by an Englishman, right? I mean, that was
it can't be any coincidence that in 1816 dark syrups and color adulterants were not allowed,
right?
And then in 1817 Daniel Weir got his patent for black patent malt.
Exactly.
And then everyone started using it.
Yeah. Well, before we get into traditional brewing methods, which I'll be honest with you, I feel like we adopted so many of our brewing methods, modern brewing methods from English, that it's not terribly different than what you might do today. Just some quick stats on English porter. You're looking at an OG between 1040 and 1052 or so. Yep.
That's 10 to 13 Plato for non-freedom numbers.
and then you're looking for it to attenuate down to about 1008 to 1014, which is about 2 to 7 degrees Plato, or I'm sorry, 2 to 4.5 degrees Plato. Yeah.
3.5. Yeah.
Yeah. So that gets you an ABV of about 4 to 5.4%. I tend to prefer mine sort of in the mid range there. I like to go for about 1045 to 1048 OG, and then have it finish around 1012, which I do that using a slightly higher mash temperature typically. ABV typically right around 4.8 to 5%. IBU, you're looking at 18 to 35. Now, traditionally, when you're hopping an English porter, Malcolm, are you going mostly, early kettle additions, mid, late? You doing kind of the staggered thing?
I don't do a lot of mid kettle hopping. I started doing more of that, or thinking more about it when I came to Fatheads, because Matt Cole likes to do a lot of mid kettle hopping. Between 90 and 0.
Yeah.
Depending on how you're boiling, but. Yeah, I think there's some validity to it for like this mouthfeel and potentially flavor that I didn't respect as much before I came here.
Yeah.
But I tend to do 60 minutes for bittering and then late hopping.
Yeah.
That's what I tend to do. So I would add for like a 5-gallon batch, which for me is 6 gallons because I want to get 5 to the keg, about 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces of EKG, our Fuggles at 60, and then almost the same, maybe like 1 to 1.25 at flame out. Just to get some flavor, and maybe boil that for 5 minutes max.
Yeah, I do tend to favor a small-ish, maybe 14 to 21 grams, so 1/2 ounce to 3/4 of an ounce or so of a 30-minute, 25 to 30-minute boil addition. That's just kind of something I started doing after I heard another, lauded commercial brewer, Matt Brynildson from Firestone Walker.
So those two guys know what they're talking about. They're both named Matt. They both make good hoppy beers.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Sometimes you just have to salute and say you're probably right. I'm not an appeal to authority guy, but continued success has to have some merit.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So, and then you're looking in terms of color, between 20 to 30 SRM. Again, that gets you from the sort of dark brown, but still, you can see through it, up towards almost black, but with still kind of ruby on the edges there. Just a really nice, you want it to be clear. I think that's a big thing with a lot of English beers is that they really, they're the ones who started using isinglass and whatnot. There's that as well. So now in terms of a traditional, not traditional, but the way a modern brewer might typically approach making an English porter, let's spend a little bit of time talking about water chemistry, because I think most people are employing a regular 60-minute mash, 60-minute boil, chilling as quickly as possible, fermenting it around 19 to 20 C, which is 66 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But water chemistry for a lot of English beers is something that people tend to focus on.
Yeah, and for a porter, I would say I would go like 1-to-1 ratio of sulfite to chloride.
Yeah.
Because these beers are dry. They tend to be dry. They probably weren't way back, but the modern ones are fairly dry. So the sulfite is going to help you a little bit there, but you don't want to go high sulfite because you're not looking for that burnt snatch.
Right.
You're not looking for a hop forward beer. So, I would say 1-to-1 ratio are 0.75, meaning slightly higher chloride. But I'm almost willing to say 1-to-1 is the sweet spot for these. And you want enough carbonates, hardness, residual alkalinity to get your mash pH proper. So if you have very soft water, you might have to utilize some pickling lime or baking soda because you have a lot of chocolate and brown malt and that little 5%, a few percent of patent malt. It's going to drive your pH down. So you got to be mindful of that.
Yeah. There are very few exceptions of styles that I don't prefer a higher sulfate to chloride ratio. This is one of the ones. I just feel like for the most part, when you're brewing a lower OG style like this, and again, I tend to aim for that 1045 to 1048 range on English porter and milds and such. I do find that slightly more. Relative to my preferences, slightly more chloride, so that balanced water profile does support the mouthfeel a bit more. It gives it the perception of more body, and I feel like that really works well with these styles. So that's my suggestion as well.
And if you get too dry in the palate, which not just attenuation but also sulfate, that roast could be louder than you intended.
Yeah.
Something to consider.
It really accentuates the sharpness of the roast malt. Yeah. This is another one. I feel like again, if you're going lower AG for the mash temperature, you want to stick somewhere in the middle range. You want to go for more of like a medium mouthfeel temperature, medium body mash temperature somewhere at 152 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that is 154 seems to work really well.
Yeah, this is a medium light to medium. Like they are quite dry. So this is one of those things where you have to adjust your mash, in my opinion, to the yeast. So if you have a more attenuative British yeast, then you might want to mash in the 155, 156 range.
Right.
And if you have like a London 002 or a 007. But if you're using like a Whitbread, you might be able to get away with 152.
Sure.
So you have to know your tools.
Yeah, exactly.
in your ingredients.
Yeah, exactly. So other than that, you're going to boil it for about an hour, chill it as quickly as possible. I like to ferment mine right around 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius, only because I feel like it's you're not too cold, you're not too warm. And I have noticed, in fact, we've done an experiment on fermentation temperature with the Fuller strain. And, warmer temperatures can produce a really delicious beer, but it does seem to have a touch more esters. So if that's your thing, go for it. And then I feel like that we have to spend a little bit of time talking about either fining and filtration because of isinglass. I don't know anybody who's using isinglass these days, but I definitely like to make sure that mine's crystal clear by fining with gelatin.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people using isinglass because the producers of those processing agents are making a lot of it. So there are people who are using it, mostly English brewers, of course, but there's some craft breweries over here who use it. It is, in my opinion, and recent struggles with some clarities and doing some trials, it seems to be the best at what it does.
Fascinating. I've never used it.
It is super efficient at clarifying a beer. Now, obviously, there's the issue of having something in your beer as a processing agent that some people may be allergic to or might be against for various reasons.
Sure.
So you can get Biofine to work very well with some optimization, but gelatin has the same issues that isinglass has, is that it's an animal product. Even though it should not be in the beer, technically, it is an animal product, so some people don't like that, for whatever reason. That's their own. But gelatin, for the home brewers, I mean, it's powdered time. So these beers tend to be very clear.
Yeah, I prefer them very clear. And then some more interesting stuff. I know we don't want to spend too much time talking about firkins, but a traditional English way of packaging beer bulk-wise is in a firkin, and then it naturally carbonates that way, and you pour it out. Most people aren't doing that these days. There are a lot of breweries who I see, still serving from a firkin. But when it comes to carbonation of this style, it's pretty traditional. Well, to carbonate it relatively low, somewhere around 2.2 volumes. Malcolm, is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, so in the low twos for a cask or keg, if you can do it, which is hard in the U.S. because everyone serves at the same pressure, so it's eventually going to come up. Yeah. But the bottled versions tended to be a little bit higher. So, 2.5 to 2.6.
That's more normal. Yeah, what we'd expect
that's typical.
From pretty typical beer. I prefer mine with a little bit more carbonation personally. And then obviously, who hasn't heard that English beer is served at cellar temperatures, which is around, 52 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 10 to 11 degrees Celsius, I believe.
Yeah. You usually people say 11 to 13. Yeah. So Celsius, cellar temperature. And I'm telling you, you owe it to yourself to try a good English porter on cask and at the proper temperature. It's different. It's just different.
It is different. And here's what I do, because I'm not going to change the temperature of my Keyser. I'll just serve my cold beer and start drinking it and kind of nurse it in a big no-nick, English no-nick pint. And then when I'm halfway done, it's lost some carbonation and warmed up a bit. So now I'm getting the best of both worlds, right?
Sure.
So that's
it's going to store better and longer at the cooler temperature.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's okay to just pour it and wait.
Yep, exactly. Well, all right. When we come back from this break, we're going to be getting into my experience brewing up an English porter using, let's just say, less than acceptable methods. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com.
Just as the Grainfather all-in-one brewing system revolutionized all grain brewing at home, the Grainfather conical fermenter and glycol chiller take this one step further by giving homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation, just like commercial breweries use. With a full array of features including insulated double-walled construction, an innovative dual-valve yeast dump and sampling tap, and an integrated heating element and temperature controller, the conical fermenter provides a professional quality fermenting environment for superior temperature control. With the ability to individually power and control the temperature of up to 4 Grainfather conical fermenters, each with their own fermenting schedule, the Grainfather Glycol Chiller is the perfect addition to ensure superior fermenting results. And for a limited time, you can save 10% on your order by going to grainfather.com and entering coupon code NZB during checkout. Once again, enter coupon code NZB when you order the Grainfather conical fermenter or glycol chiller at grainfather.com. Once again, that's grainfather.com.
While I may not be the most experienced with this style, I have found that English Porter can be rather approachable for those who might not be into more flavorful beer. I've brewed various English styles in the past using standard methods. A few months back, though, I made what may have been my first true English Porter, and I did it short and shoddy style.
Blasphemous.
I knew you were going to say something like that. So for this one, I did a full volume brew in a bag. That's my typical approach nowadays, using the SS Brewtech 1V electric brewing system. Makes this process very easy. For such a nice piece of gear, going short and shoddy about it's kind of, ironic, I think. But here, anyways, around 11:06 a.m. I believe it was a Saturday morning, I collected the full volume of filtered water. I didn't adjust it with any minerals at all. My house water here is actually fairly balanced. I think I'm at 2 or 4 ppm sulfate to like 6 chloride. It's pretty low in terms of mineral. So I just left it alone. I wasn't going to mess around with that. And then I set the controller on my electric element to start heating the water up. I proceeded to weigh out and mill the grains after that while the water was being heated. Now for this batch, I went with what I had on hand, which actually wasn't too far off, but it also wasn't terribly traditional. That was 90% Maris Otter. And just as an aside, that Maris Otter was sitting in an open sack in my garage for, 9-10 months prior to brewing this beer. I had some medium UK crystal sitting around, so I did 5% of the grist with that. I had some British roasted barley, that really dark 500 Lovabond roasted barley. Yeah. So I went with 4% of that in the grist. That one is a little off there, right? This was not black patent. And then because I wanted to amplify that nuttiness, I went with 1% pale chocolate malt. And I like to use pale chocolate to again, really accentuate the more nutty kind of mid palate nuttiness of a beer. I know that, again, roasted barley, that's not a traditional ingredient in English Porter.
Roasted barley, no, that was mostly used for the stouts, right? Known for the stouts over in Ireland. So when they started brewing porters, and they started going for non-malted material for once again tax avoidance.
Yeah, exactly.
That was one of the things people say. That's the difference between stout and porter, but that's another conversation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We heard about it. I went with a single infusion mash for this bad boy at 154 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 68 degrees Celsius for just 30 minutes. So half the amount of time typical brewers might use for this. And then I removed the grain bag. I squeezed the hell out of the grain bag until I reached my pre-boil volume, and then I set my controller to heat that wort up to a boil. I then boiled the wort for a mere 25 minutes rather than the typical hour, adding 17 grams of Magnum at 20 minutes. Magnum, obviously not a traditional English hop, but it's great for bittering. I like to use it in any beer at this point.
It's freaking German, you idiot.
I know this is an English-German thing. I get into trouble talking too much about that, but
it's as a German hop and a Irish adjunct.
That's right. Yeah. And I did add 30 grams of Fuggles with 10 minutes left in the boil, and that was my redeeming hop addition there.
Just saying, God saves the Queen.
While I'm adding the Fuggles, exactly. I chilled the wort very quickly using my jaded chiller there, and I got it to as cold as I could get it in a matter of 5-6 minutes, which ended up being around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. Refractometer reading at this point showed that I hit 1047 OG for a brew house efficiency of 63%. Not too shabby considering the 30-minute mash. And this is pretty typical for me when I'm doing short and shoddy batches that are 1050 OG or less. Had I extended that mash rest out to the full 60 minutes, I'm pretty sure I would have seen closer to 68 to 70% efficiency. At least that's what I'm used to getting. So, but I was pleased. 63% I'm totally fine with. And that OG was right smack where I like to have my my lower OG English beers be. So finally, I racked that wort onto the yeast cake of an Imperial Imperial Yeast A01 House. House is the Whitbread dry strain, so that is a more traditional English ale yeast. That yeast cake had previously been used to ferment an American amber ale, which I didn't dry hop. At least I don't believe I dry hopped it. We'll have to talk about that on another show. But it was using a bunch of American, modern fruity American hops. So that some of that made it through, some in the first batch. That American amber ale was probably present in the yeast. Would that have an impact on the beer? I didn't know, but this was short and shoddy. So that fermenter was then placed in my fermentation chamber, which I always just keep controlled to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C, my standard ale fermentation temperature. At this point in time, it was pretty cool outside, so it would have probably stayed about that temperature anyways had I just left it in my garage. At this point, it was 1:06 in the afternoon, so exactly 2 hours. If you add in the time it took me to clean everything up, which wasn't much considering my system, I'd say the entire brew day was about 2 hours and 15 minutes. Not too shabby.
Not too bad, man. That's pretty quick.
Quick enough for you to judge me, huh? To want to judge me on it.
Yeah, that only takes me like 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, the fermenter was then connected to my. I've talked about it a lot, but this CO2 capture rig. To me, it's one of the shortiest but not so shoddy approaches that I've adopted over the last year, where I use the naturally produced CO2 from fermentation to push star sand out of one keg and into a secondary keg, thus also purging the primary keg that the beer will eventually be racked into. So, reduce O2 very easily. It's pretty cool stuff. After, I think it was about a week or so, I noticed that fermentation was dying down, activity was dying down. So I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer had reached 1011 FG, which is exactly what was expected based on what Beersmith was saying. And so I swapped out my CO2 capture rig with actual tank of CO2, applied 1 PSI of pressure, and started to cold crash again. Not the shoddiest of approaches, but I hate oxidized beer, so I'm just not going to do that. I added gelatin fining the following day, and then I let it sit another 2 days before transferring that beer into that primary keg that had been purged with naturally produced CO2. The keg of beer was then placed in my Keyser and burst carbonated overnight. I think I did 45 PSI for about 16 hours. Again, I like that more, 2.5 volumes of CO2, a little bit more fizzy of a beer. And then I think it was 4 days later, I started serving this beer to tasters. This was pre-COVID-19, so we weren't breaking any rules. But yeah, what do you think of that process, Malcolm?
I think if you're clean, hot side, of course, up until pitching, the biggest thing you can do to have great beer is not oxidize it.
Yeah.
So that push out rig is amazing. I love it. Only thing I would say is spund it sooner so you capture some CO2.
So that I'm kegging carbonated beer, you're saying?
Yeah, at least partially. Get it up to like one volume.
Yeah.
But I mean that's just great.
Yeah.
That's just a great way to protect your beer.
I agree. I love it. I've been using it on every batch because it's actually easier than any other kegging approach that I've used.
Yeah,
so to me, it's shorter. It looks really high tech, and that's because the gear is. But this isn't about using the cheapest gear. This is about reducing the brew day and seeing what comes of it. So, well, objectively, when you looked at this beer, it was absolutely crystal clear. A beautiful dark brown color with beige cap of foam. There was nice kind of red hues on the side of the glass. You can see the picture for yourself over on the website. But I was absolutely pleased.
Yeah, it looks nice. You have clean nails, which is important to me. But it's a great hue. It has like that dark leather mahogany look, and I love it. That looks really nice. It has the tan head on it, the tan foam. And the topiary in the background is nice too. That's pretty pinkies out, dude. That's pretty pinkies out. Right there.
Yeah. There you go. I do believe that the tan head is something that I've heard doesn't typically happen if you use black patent malt. That's more associated with roasted barley, or am I backwards on that?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. I think if you have a high percentage of brown malt or crystal and then black patent, you get more of an off-white head.
Yeah, this was definitely more beige. I mean, I think that adequately sums that up. So,
yeah.
All right, before we get to the blind taster results, my impressions, I absolutely loved this beer. And I wasn't the only one. A lot of my friends locally here, are drinking, if they're into the craft thing, they're drinking mostly hoppy IPA, or right now they're drinking nice pale crisp lagers. And I've got a whole other crew of friends who drink mostly Miller Lite. This beer seemed to be enjoyed by all swaths of beer drinkers, which I thought was a lot of fun. We couldn't keep this keg around long. I mean, we couldn't drink enough. It was so good. Definitely, in my opinion, similar in character to other English porters that I've tasted. Toasty, nutty flavors, subtle roast that wasn't overwhelming at all. Again, I did blended with that medium crystal malt. I think it created more of a chocolate character that was slightly roasty. There was that light ester character that I always get from when I use AO9 Pub or Whitbread Dry, the AO1 House. Just really nice in the background, balances out the malt really well, and a really low hop aroma and flavor, probably, to my palate, more earthy than it was fruity. Right up there with other examples that I've tried. I thought it was really nice.
Yeah, I think you got to start sending me these beers so I could taste them, because I want so bad to criticize you.
I know you do. I know.
But I haven't tasted it. I can just say the recipe looks like a dog's lunch.
Well, it sort of was.
but good is good. So that's cool.
Yeah, and we are our own worst critics in brewing, and I got to be honest. What I'm learning based on my personal experience is that it really does seem that the key thing in brewing a decent tasting beer, a good tasting beer, is minding sanitation, not contaminating it, and then not oxidizing the beer. You can get away with a lot of corner cutting if you're just minding those two things. So, I ended up serving this beer to 16 tasters. Again, this was pre-coronavirus. We're not going out to pubs these days anymore. But participants were informed of the style and asked to evaluate the beer based on both previous experiences with that style, if they had previous experience, as well as the BJCP style description, which we provide to them. One of the first things we asked them is to rate the three main characteristics: hoppy, malty, and dry. Tasters in terms of this one, so that we can kind of compare the three next to each other. They seem to perceive the strongest characteristic as being the beer's dryness, which to me makes a lot of sense given the low OG, and the Whitbread Dry, that AO1 House, is a very attenuative yeast. And then maltiness was a very close second. I mean, we're talking within less than half of a point on average difference there. And then, as expected, hoppiness was the lowest rated characteristic.
Yeah, that's in line. I just drank a bunch of these while studying some styles a while back, and that's what I got. I got a nutty, slightly estery, dry fruit, and then well attenuated.
Yeah.
And with a whisper of hop character. And that was only on the best examples that were fresh.
Yeah. Yeah. If I were to go back and redo this beer, I probably would skip on the AO1 House and go with AO9 Pub. That's the fuller strain, specifically because it's slightly less attenuative. And I love lower alcohol beers because it means you get to drink more. But I'd go back and I'd use the fuller strain. And also I do get a slightly different, I'm not saying necessarily more, but a slightly different ester character out of it personally. But that's what I would do differently. Now we had tasters go and rate each characteristic to break it down in terms of hop, malt, yeast, and other characteristics. In terms of hop character, the most prominent hop characteristic, 13 out of 16 people said earthy. I could not agree more. That's exactly what I got out of it, and it makes sense considering, a little over an ounce of Fuggles were used with 10 minutes left in the boil. I think when you add that to that sort of the dry, roasty thing that you get from roasted barley. It makes perfect sense. 2 people said floral and 1 person said spicy. Seems right about in line to me.
Yep. Yeah, I think in floral and spicy, I think could be mistaken or confused with earthy, or they could also be there as well. So no big deal with those hops. Yeah.
Well, yeah. When we get to the yeast character thing, in fact, we'll talk about it now. So 7 out of 16 people thought that the ester characteristic was the strongest in terms of yeast character. I agree with that. That's what I would have put, though this beer was incredibly clean as well. 5 out of 16 people said that it was clean. 2 people each said that it was phenolic and had a sulfur note to it. I'm not sure where the sulfur thing came from, but the phenolic thing, it seems like some people to me, and we provide little descriptions in the survey of what each of these means. I think they mistake that slight roasty character as being a sort of a phenolic thing.
That is a phenolic. Right?
Exactly.
The roasty character is a phenol. So yeah, and that's the only complaint I really have of the recipe is the ability of that to occur. It was all that roasted barley with a well attenuated beer, and there's roast in the pale chocolate.
Yeah.
And a medium to dark crystal has like a burnt raisiny character.
Sure does.
You're tripling down on roast. So, and I think someone else later on said metallic. And that makes sense. When I have a high roasted beer, I sometimes get metallic as well. So
yeah, no, you ain't wrong, man. I mean, I agree with you. Again, short and shoddy, I was seeing what we could get away with what I had on my shelf. So in terms of malt character, 7 out of 16 people said toasty, 5 people said roasty. So that goes along with what you were saying, Malcolm. 5 people out of 16, that's just about a third. So 3 people said nutty, and then 1 person said caramel sweet. All 4 of those characteristics, toasty, roasty, nutty, and caramelly sweet, all make sense to me with this beer. I could have seen myself, being persuaded into choosing any one of those. I would have rated it toasty. That was the most prominent characteristic I got.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's, if you read the style guidelines, at least for the BJCP, if you just knock that roast down, to like a 2 or a 1, and then up the caramel and sweet, you're there.
Yeah.
So that's just obviously just going off of analytics, because saying again, I did not taste the beer, but it looks like it's pretty,
fairly
right
spot
characteristics
on.
are there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned it already, but 1 person did say that they perceived a metallic off flavor. And then another person said yeasty. I don't know if yeasty meant the estery thing, or if they honestly thought that they were tasting that sharp yeast bite, but the beer was crystal clear and I did not get yeasty at all. Metallic is an interesting one. I don't know who listed that, but while I was drinking with old Timmy Tim, he did mention that he picked up a sort of a metallic thing as well. I wasn't keened in on it. I wasn't, I didn't notice it until he said that. And it made me think back to years ago. I made a stout. It was a relatively quote unquote pale stout. It wasn't, you couldn't see through it, or you could see through it. But it also had this metallic thing. Made me wonder if, again, that might be a function of the roasted barley with the more attenuative yeast.
Yeah, that's my experience. And there's a pretty well-known brewery in the Midwest that I think makes good beers, but I tend to get a little bit metallic on some of their darker beers. And I haven't tried to dig down to see what malts it is and which ingredients it is that's causing it, but it seems to be pretty common through 3 or 4 of their beers, and some of their beers are listed in the classic styles. So,
that's interesting.
It doesn't mean that it's not bad. It just means that I'm sensitive in that beer to that.
Sure.
I'm not, and I've talked to some other people too, but and they get something similar. But it seems to be a certain amount of roast in certain styles can start to become metallic.
Yeah.
Because I don't get metallic out of Guinness.
No, me either. Not at all.
It's a real soft bitterness. Roasty bitterness. So. Yeah, it just has to be like an interplay between the roast character, the dryness, and the water chemistry. Yeah.
Well, and again, this was only 2 people. 1 person said metallic, 1 said yeasty out of 16. Not a single person, I think it stands to be noted, said DMS, said diacetyl, said acetaldehyde, anything that you might expect based on this crazy, blasphemous brewing approach I took. So I thought that was a bit of a success, at least based on the blind taster data. Now, the next question we asked, and I always really enjoy this one, is how well, based on what, the the style description that we gave to the survey, the participants on English Porter. We ask how well did this version that they're drinking represent the style based on that description. 3 out of 16 thought it was a spot on example and rated it a 5 out of 5. 7 more gave it a 4 out of 5. 5 said a 3 out of 5, and 1 gave it a 2 out of 5. Nobody rated it anything lower than a 2 out of 5 on a 0 to 5 point scale. If it were me, I tend to be a little bit hard on myself, and I agree with a lot of what you were saying about the use of roasted barley and stuff like that. I probably would have gone in the 3 or 4 out of 5 range. It really did taste very similar on most scales. It tasted very similar to a lot of the beers that I've tasted.
This is clearly a bad palate example here, bad palates. So I'm just sticking with that. Digitally, I give it a 1 or a 2.
Thank you very much. You are that guy, Malcolm. That's great. Well, here's the more fun part because it's more subjective. I guess all of this is highly subjective, but we asked people how much they enjoyed the beer, essentially. What is their preference rating? And that's, again, a 0 to 5 scale. 5 being it was excellent, I could drink this all the time. 0 being this is the worst swill I've ever had. 5 out of 16 people gave it a 5 out of 5. 6 more, so 11 in total, but 6 more rated it a 4 out of 5. 4 rated it a 3 out of 5, and only 1 gave it a 2 out of 5. Nobody rated it a 1 or a 0 out of 5. I have to believe that there is an element of people just not liking darker styles like this, or people just not liking lower ABV beers, and that may have influenced them. Nobody who I served it to thought that the beer was technically flawed or bad. And I served this to, fairly discerning beer drinkers.
So good is good, right? Once you take away, is it to style, or you didn't tell them it was a high or low alcohol beer, except for maybe hinting at the style when you said, is it to style, meaning is it a English porter? But I made an Irish red a while ago. I think it was one of the first times I started following recipes from a book. I think it was Jamil's book.
Yeah.
And I made his Irish red. But me and a buddy of mine, I think we either made a mistake or someone mismeasured. I'm going to blame him. And I think we added too much crystal and a little bit too much of the roasted barley. I think I had a little bit of roasted barley for color. I'm just really going by memory of like 10 years ago. But,
yeah.
So in the end, it was not an Irish red. So I think someone double measured, and it was a little bit too high of ABV and a little too roasty.
Yeah.
But it was delicious. And I have made it occasionally with the errors since then.
Yeah.
Because it tastes almost like a Trois house ale. It has like that burnt marshmallow red ale character with a little bit more roast, and I love it.
Yeah,
so,
it sounds delicious.
So that's basically what I'm going in for, is that even though it's not, well, people thought it was a good representation of a porter, but even if it wasn't a porter, it can still be wonderful. And that's one of the neat things about brewing. We talked about that old experiment when I did the aged extract.
Yeah.
When they were given no context as to what that beer was, people thought it was the aged extract. They thought it was a good example of a Scottish ale.
Yeah.
So they weren't told it was supposed to be I think it was a Pilsner or a Helles, whatever.
Yeah.
So they just said, this is good. And in here, same thing with preference. People are like, this is good.
I think that's the case with a lot of beers that people brew in general. You and I have both said on how many, judging panels where you're told it's a specific style. So you're judging it to that style, but it's based a lot on your perception and what you've read. And so I agree with that. But I have to say though, the fact that so many people enjoyed this beer at the very least says to me, regardless, it seemed relatively representative of style as well, but regardless of how representative of style it was, the beer turned out really good. I even felt like it was a pretty good representation of an English porter. So I was pleased with it and thought it was really good. I couldn't detect any glaring flaws, particularly as it might relate to how it was brewed. And I thought that was pretty exciting. So now we do have some reader comments to get to, not too many, but I want to read some of these off because I think they're pretty interesting. The first one comes from QQ, who left a comment on the article. He says, brown malt is pretty much essential for London porter. The fuller Fuller's version is 14% crystal, 10% brown malt, 1.5% chocolate malt, and no roast. Repeat, no roast, he says. The whole point was that porter and stout porter represented different strength brews from the same party guile originally, but the influence of Guinness means that UK stouts are now weaker than porter.
Yeah, I have a Fuller's clone that I used to make quite a bit, and it's chocolate and crystal and brown and pale, like he said. I think I have 6.5% in mine for chocolate and 13% brown. But that beer is dark. That beer is super dark.
Yeah.
Like probably in the mid-30s SRM. I don't know what's Fuller's. We could look it up. Probably high 4s, low 5s. Who cares?
Yeah, yeah, it's delicious. I know that. It's probably my favorite English brewery. So
yeah, I'm a Samuel Smith Taddy Porter fan. I think that's more flavorful, more complex than the London. But yeah,
to each their own on that.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying though, QQ. Brown malt is very common in London porter. I didn't have any on hand when I decided to brew this, and hence the short and shoddy thing. But yeah, there are more traditional approaches to making this. Somebody commented, would Special B be legal in a porter? And I don't know. I didn't use Special B in this porter, but would it be legal? I mean, you can do whatever you want. It's your beer. It's certainly, I don't know if that flavor profile would fit, but maybe if you're using it at something like 1% of the grist in place of a medium crystal and some of that roasted malt or roasted grains, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I would say no, but at the same time, if you're trying to get that, burnt raisin character you get from Special B, I could see like, okay, I want the raisiny, ester component, which you could probably get from yeast. I want that burnt character, which you probably get from pale chocolate or brown malt.
Right.
So, do I think someone can make a good version of a English porter with Special B? Of course.
Sure.
But I don't think it belongs there,
It's not traditional. And that question came from Mark Rump. He commented on the Facebook post. Mark, if you make a porter with Special B, let us know. You can send one in. I'll have my friends review it. But I think it can be done. It might take some tweaking. But all right. Reddit user Tessa R. Tip says, having just bought the grains for my own porter, this was just in time. Mine's the exact opposite of short and shoddy, with a cold steep for the dark grains to reduce roasty bitterness. For the next shoddy porter, consider subbing in black malt or any dehusked grain instead of the roasted barley. More chocolatey flavor and less roast in my experience. Again, another person commenting on the use of roasted barley. I get that, but I do like the comment that Tessa R. Tip put about cold steeping the dark grains to reduce the roasty bitterness. What are your thoughts on that, Malcolm?
Yeah, I like that technique, especially for people who have softer water, because it doesn't screw up your mash pH.
Right.
It's not better. It's different. It's a tool. So if you find that your beers for a given recipe are too roasty, then taking all of it or a portion of it and steeping them cold or sparging over top of them is a great way to adjust color and get that more Schwarzbier like soft roast.
Yeah. To me, that's really more the difference. I've messed around with mash pH, lower mash pH, higher mash pH. We've done episodes on our experiments on those variables, and I'm just not seeing a huge flavor impact from the mash pH, regardless of the whether it's high or low. King G asked, what was the pH? I don't know. I didn't measure it on this one. I've just come to accept that maybe because of my, the water that I use, my pH is typically fine. He goes on to say, though, I've been adding alkalinity to my darker beers with great success recently. My base water is very soft, so if I go untreated, the mash is way too acidic. My water is very, very soft as well, and not a lot of buffering capacity. So arguably, I would assume that with the amount of roasted grains and crystal malt that I used for this short and shoddy English porter, that my mash pH was probably closer to 5.0, 5.1 rather than 5.3, 5.4. The beer turned out good. If you're concerned about mash pH, definitely pick yourself up a meter, and you can use. I don't use baking soda anymore to adjust, or I don't really adjust my mash pH much anymore, anyways. But baking soda doesn't really dissolve readily, so I've been using like pickling lime. That seems to work really well. But yeah, that's what
I like. I like pickling lime. I'll take a portion of water out and I mix it in and then add it back.
Yeah, and it works really well. Very quick.
Or you can do a portion of wort if you're trying to mash or adjust your mash pH midstream. I take a little bit of wort add a little bit of pickling lime, mix it up. Obviously, you're going to be oxidizing a little bit, boohoo, and then you add it back because it dissolves better in wort than it does water.
Yeah, yeah. Well, all right. That just about covers English Porter. Any final words, Malcolm?
It's a great beer, underappreciated by the more casual drinkers. You know, the hop heads. I think you owe it to yourself to try a cask version. Go out to a local publican when things get less crazy. You know, post Rona. Go try a cask version or do it yourself. You know, you can there's articles online about making a corny keg into a cask.
Yeah.
It's a great way to have some people over, maybe post-apocalypse, have a cask ale tapping party and try to crush a keg.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to have an English Porter will be surprised with how delicious they really can be.
Absolutely. And I do think that making a gravity poured cask out of a corny keg it's a neat little project. You probably have some time in your hands right now. I think the guys from the old Northern Brewer crew, they had a cool video on how to make a cask out of a corny keg. It's pretty neat.
Yeah.
But it's a great style for cask, and why not, right?
Yeah, why not? And arguably, if it weren't for English Porter, we wouldn't have the delicious American Porter that so many of us enjoy today. All right, if you'd like to read more about this short and shoddy brew day, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about it over at brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through